Hello, I'm John Harney, the executive editor of the New England Journal of Higher Education. I'm joined by my colleague, NEJHE President and CEO Michael Thomas, for a conversation with Lawrence Schall, the president of the New England Commission on Higher Education. NEJHE, as the commission is known, is the regional accrediting body for more than 200 institutions of higher education in the 6 New England states and 12 American-style institutions in other countries. Larry joined NEJHE in July of 2020 after 15 years as president of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, and several years before that as a senior administrator at Swarthmore College, his alma mater. He also holds graduate degrees in law and education from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Larry.
Good to be with you both.
Let me start. The tour you embarked on when you started at NEJHE seemed fascinating to me. Can you tell us about a few of the interesting things you learned from that experience?
Sure, and the tour continues. I think we maybe visited 20 or so institutions over the course of 10 or 11 days, but I think we're now up to close to 40 or 50 that we've had a chance to see, mostly in the States, but also a number abroad. So, first of all, we embarked on it. I don't, it's hard to say when was the middle of COVID. I just got my second booster this morning.
It has to end before we know when the middle was, I guess.
Yeah, right? Exactly. So, but we were heavy into COVID, and so there were students on some campuses, but not all. We tried to meet outside, so it was a little hard, but people were accommodating. Well, what struck me is something that I knew, but sort of being on these campuses, it hit you really in your face, was just this extraordinary diversity of the institutions in New England, the institutions we accredit. So, one morning I sitting talking to Paula Blank at Southern New Hampshire with 150,000 students. And then I drive a few miles and I'm with one of our schools that enrolls 80 students. A small, great books, Catholic college. And that just kept happening. We're at the University of New Hampshire, and then we were a small New Hampshire community college. And then we were at, Mount Holyoke, a wealthy liberal arts college. And then we were at Hampshire, same day with a little less money. So, every one of these was fascinating. They each have their own mission, which I think is the sort of the strength of American higher education. Committed leadership. And again, because we were in COVID, institutions had to turn on a dime, and I think their resiliency, the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that people don't necessarily associate with higher education in America was quite evident.
Obviously, you've spoken to sort of the issue of living these interesting times, certainly the pandemic. Layer on top of that a lot of work on campuses, obviously, to leverage distance education to assist students while they've been off campus or as they've been dealing with the realities of partial campus closure or quarantining. And certainly a lot of this has occurred also in time of sort of a racial reckoning within the country. And just tell us from the standpoint of your work and the work of the commission, how are you thinking about these sort of large overarching issues, the real, I think, renewed interest and focus in diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. Obviously, from what we can tell, certainly an interest in continuation of hybrid learning and other elements of the pandemic.
Yeah, so, one of the differences between, being a college president or administrator, which I did for 30 years, and leading the New England Commission is that, we are not certainly as subject to the sort of as the winds blow, the massive changes that you got to deal with every day on campus. I mean, we have 9 standards. Those standards don't change in the midst of a pandemic. we do every 5 years, we do a standard revision. I mean, we're a membership organization, so our standards are driven by our members. And we did in 2020, when we last revised our standards, we strengthened them with regard to DEI. But again, for the most part, our schools would ask us, we're in the middle of COVID, are you going to relax your financial oversight? And the answer is no. We're cognizant that the strains that COVID put on institutions. On the other hand, I think some of our institutions that are the most financially fragile, if you looked at their balance sheets over the last 2 years because of the inflow of federal and state money, those balance sheets were actually sometimes healthier than they had been in years. And so, we've got a very close eye on the financial stability of those institutions coming out of the pandemic, or at least coming out of the time when there was such outside support. So, again, you're president of an institution these days. There's this incredible amount of stress and pressure to deal with these both internal and external events in the world. And it's not that we're immune from them, but we've got a sort of longer view. It's an easier place to be a president of the New England Commission than to be president of a college these days.
We know from our conversations with presidents and some survey research we've done that there seems to be a strong interest in sort of continued use of hybrid learning models, and not well defined. But I'd be curious to sort of know what you're learning and hearing from your institutions in terms of sort of changing the models, if you will.
Yeah, so it varies institution to institution. I think most of the institutions that were heavily residential, we've got a lot of them are for the most part back to being heavily residential. I do think they are using remote learning in new and different ways, and they generally see that as a good thing. We in New England, we have institutions that have been doing online learning and remote learning for decades, and so we require institutions, and always have, to do assessment of that modality in the same way they assess face-to-face learning. And so this was not a new thing for us. The difference was, we had 200 and some institutions coming to us, in the course of a couple of months, saying, we need approval to do this. And so we had to create processes that would expedite that. And now we have institutions that are coming to us either seeking general approval to do this across programs, or which is generally seen as more than 50% of a program, or limited approval, which means some part of a course is being delivered remotely. And these days, some part of almost every course has some remote learning. So we're seeing dozens and dozens of our institutions coming to us over time. But again, it's not a new thing for us. It's just the volume changed.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Switching gears a little bit, NEJHE has enabled member institutions to engage in what you call pilot projects that are focused on, and this is, I think, is a quote from your guidelines, perceptive and imaginative innovation aimed at increasing the effectiveness of higher education. Can you tell us more about that and what you've learned in that process?
Yeah. So again, we have 9 standards, and what the pilot project, which was adopted maybe 3 years ago, allows is for an institution to come to us with a proposal to say, we know that the proposal we're bringing to you today is out of compliance with at least one of your standards, which in the past we would have said, well, that's the end of the conversation. We have 9 standards. You need to be in compliance with all of them. So they come to us explicitly saying, here's the standard, we're out of compliance. We want to try this experiment. We want you to, we're going to review it, assess it. We want you to do the same. And we'll come back at up to 4 years. We sort of permit that and come back and do an assessment. So I think we've had only 2 institutions that have received approval under the pilot project so far, though we've at our meeting in 2-3 weeks, we got another 2 coming to us with ideas. And in the fall, we've got another 2 coming to us with another idea. So one of our standards is that students that graduate from one of our institutions have to have a proficiency in English language. And we have institutions that have said, we want to expand our reach into Latin America and teach Spanish-speaking students. And the goal is not to have them graduate and come to the United States to work. It's to remain in their, remain in Mexico or in Chile or Colombia. And the requirement that they be proficient in English doesn't make sense in that regard. And so we've approved a pilot under that allows that to happen, again, inconsistent with one of our standards. In the fall, we believe, right, we have written into our standards that a baccalaureate degree has to be 120 credit hours. We think 2 institutions coming to us with a proposal to do a baccalaureate short of 120 hours. So that would have to be approved under our pilot project. So these are, these are experiments, and they're meant to sort of help the institution make its way, but also to sort of inform the commission that, we may have a standard that next time we do a revision, we may want to consider changing the standard.
In the issue of something like credit hours, is there also a state role?
So it can be. We operate traditionally in 6 states, and each of those states has different rules.
Mm-hmm.
But programs, for the most part, in order for a school to start a new program, it needs state approval.
Right.
And state approval is different than NEJHE approval.
Well, that's interesting to hear. And I think it's, interesting to hear that you've got, a small but steady flow of institutions that appear to be, considering some changes and some potential pilot projects. We'd be curious to know what else the commission is thinking about in terms of fostering and supporting innovation. Certainly, given the context of New England higher education relative to demographics and enrollment and some of the financial sustainability challenges, certainly know the commission is thinking a lot about, institutional futures and their ability to adapt and adjust to the realities of the environment. What else is the commission thinking about in terms of being able to be supportive of innovation?
So I'll say 2 things. So another one of the pilot projects we approved came as a result of a merger / acquisition of one institution over another institution. And we are seeing the pace of these mergers and acquisitions pick up. They've existed for a long time, but certainly we're seeing more of them. And so what happens in these cases around governance can be pretty complex, particularly in this transition. And so this one of the pilot projects we approved allowed this merger acquisition to move forward, even though the governance structure in the short run likely didn't comply with our governance standard, but we sort of approved it as a short-term bridge to get to the right place. So governance is an issue that comes up a lot in our meetings with institutions, and when there was not as much merger consolidation activity, it came up less frequently, but it's coming up a lot now. So we did in the 2020 revision of our standards change the governance language a bit to create a little more flexibility. And so that's an ongoing conversation. Another subject we're we have a retreat every June, and another subject that's going to be on the agenda is whether the commission has a role, a quality assurance role for educational programs that are provided by non-traditional providers. We know now that, you know, millions and millions of students, young and old, are getting trained, getting education, not in a four-year baccalaureate degree or a master's program degree, but in certifications. And so, you know, right now we accredit institutions, we don't accredit programs, and we accredit degree granting institutions. And so it's an interesting question for us is, might we have some role in quality assurance for either institutions or programs that are delivered from non-traditional providers? You know, that'd be a big move for us, but it's, you know, the higher education world has shifted, and so we sort of think about, do we shift with it? Another, you know, you introduced this, you said, you know, we're one of the 6 regional accrediting agencies. So as of July 2020, they're really, although we still call ourselves a regional accrediting agency, we are accrediting institutions outside of the 6 states. As you mentioned, we accredit 12 institutions abroad. I'm headed to Vietnam and Indonesia to look at 2 other schools. So we've probably got another 20 or 30 institutions abroad that are in the pipeline. But we have 7 or 8 institutions outside of New England that are seeking our accreditation now. And we had teams visiting 5 or 6 of them this spring. And so they will be in front of the commission in the fall. And they're transferring their accreditation from an existing accreditor, a non-New England accreditor, to us. So that's also a big shift for us. Most of them right now that are looking at us are from New York, so we could still get in a car and get on the train and get to them. But we have institutions in Florida, Kansas City, DC, on the West Coast that have asked us to consider whether we would accept an application from them. So that's a big new thing for us.
Interesting. Do you think that some of these institutions see a value in the cachet of New England higher education, and they would like to be associated with that in terms of their accreditation being from New England?
I think that's definitely true of the international institutions, because they have always had the choice of they could come to New England or to go to the Southern region. And so there is a cachet about New England. I think the domestic ones are less about that than they are. Each of the regionals has this little bit of a different way of doing business. It's not so much that we have different standards, but it isn't so much that our standards are different or that any one of them is easier than another or harder than another. But I think because of our size, and we have, again, only a little over 200 institutions, and some of the regionals have closer to 1,000. So I think because of our size and because of the culture in New England, we've got a sort of a more personal way of doing business. We've got relationships with our member institutions, that we value and that they value, and I think people that's appealing to others.
And just building on that, Larry, so, you mentioned sort of this, collapsing distinction between sort of the regional and the national. Do you feel like this is sort of a widespread phenomenon? Are you hearing and seeing sort of further evidence of institutions moving from accreditor to accreditor? And do you see that sort of primarily from formerly regional to another formerly regional, or are you seeing sort of previously nationally accredited coming into regional accreditation?
It's a little bit of both in that regard. it's hard to know, where this will go. This movement of these institutions in New England is really the first movement we've seen. So it is, I don't think there's going to be a mad rush. And hopefully we don't have any of our institutions deciding to go somewhere else. Florida, the politics in Florida are always interesting, but the governor is either signed or about to sign this piece of legislation that's going to require the public institutions in Florida to actually switch accreditors every time they are accredited.
Yeah.
Which is silly. It would be a nice way to say it.
High switching costs, I'm guessing. Is
Yeah,
that true?
and we would have no interest in sort of stepping into that. Our relationship with our members goes, is a long-term relationship. Having someone come in for 5 years or 10 years and then go find someone else just makes, it makes no sense for either an accreditor or for an institution. But there's a fair amount that happens in Florida that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
So if you were asked to invent a new accreditation system today, what would be the kind of standards that you would use?
Yeah, so I think the real value of the way that accreditation works with the regionals anyway is that it's a peer evaluation system, and people from the outside could sort of say, well, that sort of doesn't seem right, that peers are evaluating other peers and aren't isn't there a sort of insider game? But the reality when you read these reports of a team of eight higher educational professionals from around the region, around the country going in, they're tough. I mean, I think in some ways they're harder on an institution than some outside body would be. So that you would design a new system, it would at its heart would be a peer review system. It's a system that has worked incredibly well, continues to work well. Whether you'd have different standards or not, I think one of the things that we focused on, and I think done a nice job of late, is you want to have rigorous standards that are not easy to meet because you're about quality. On the other hand, you don't want to have a bar to entry. So we just accredited, that's now a year or so ago, this College Unbound, which is this experimental school in Providence that 10 years ago we probably wouldn't have accredited. I mean, they, if you look at their resources, I mean, they have no endowment. They're tiny. They're trying to serve a sort of unique population of students that for whom basically any other kind of higher education hasn't worked. They award up to 20 credits for prior learning. So, I think we're proud that we didn't, again, they meet the 9 standards, same 9 standards that Harvard meets, but I think we apply them related to mission. So that's why I think you want to, particularly moving forward, you want to have the flexibility and the openness to allow new entries into the market, and not have barriers that basically just sort of keep the same 200 schools. If you go back, 20 years, we probably accredited 50 more institutions in New England than we do now. Maybe, I don't know, 40, 50. And that's a result of closures that have been happening for decades. Because New England's got a predominance of small private institutions. But of late, what we've seen is this consolidation on the public side, which is a new thing. So you've got the 12 community colleges in Connecticut becoming one. You had the 6 institutions in Maine coming under one accreditation, even though they remain separate campuses. We've got Vermont coming to us in 3 weeks to consolidate all their public institutions with the exception of University of Vermont. You've got conversations in New Hampshire. I think the only 2 states where we haven't seen sort of movement on the public side is Rhode Island, because it's so tiny, there's nothing to consolidate. We've got one community college. And then Massachusetts, where, Massachusetts is trying to do some interesting things with remote learning and online, but we've not seen any of this consolidation conversation in Massachusetts. Doesn't mean we won't, but we've not seen any. But you've seen it in Pennsylvania, you've seen it in Texas. I think with it changing demographics, with the decreasing state support of these public institutions, that consolidation is one of the strategies that states are using. Public institutions don't close in the same way that private institutions go out of business and close. It's virtually impossible to close a public institution. You can merge it and keep its campus so it closes in a sense, but because these institutions are sort of embedded in the community, politically, it's virtually impossible to shut down one of those campuses. So it's consolidation and mergers is a popular strategy at the moment.
And with that in mind, what is sort of your prognostication for the region in the coming couple of years? And, you mentioned sort of some flexibility relative to sort of governance in some recent activity, but, what else do you think NEJHE will sort of think about or contemplate relative to this trend?
Yeah, so you will continue to see some closures. I'm not a believer in the sort of doomsday, half the schools are going to shut down. But again, we've seen closures are not new in New England, and we'll continue to see them. But, I think what we are seeing now is that schools, whether they're financially healthy or not, so many institutions are having high-level conversations with the board about partners, acquisitions, mergers, and doing so at a time when it used to be that you started that conversation when you had one sort of foot in the ground, and now again, schools that are healthy, schools that aren't close to going under, realize that, as they look forward 5-10 years, that aligning with someone with another institution makes a lot of sense. So I think you'll see a lot more of that. There's been a
more strategic and proactive approach to it then. Yeah.
And we tend to be in the middle of those conversations at some point, because again, they're complicated. You want to make sure that there's usually an acquirer and somebody being acquired, even though they call it a merger. It's usually doesn't tend to be a merger of equals. And so we look at the acquiring institution and make sure they're able to manage and handle the change. And then the governance transition tends to be complicated. But yeah, that's what I'd say is you'll probably see more of that than you see outright closures.
What do you see as the future of the accreditation agency's sort of authority over federal financial aid funds or input on federal financial aid? Is that a key part of the mission? And
well, it's right now we say accreditation is voluntary. You don't have to be accredited, but if you want Title IV funds, you do. Mm-hmm. So if that was ever to change, and that, I mean, that comes down from the feds, you know, and that goes back half a century when the feds decided that there needed to be some way to assure that the institutions they were giving the federal money to were sustainable and high quality. And so they basically outsourced that function to us. I suppose somebody could decide at some point that the feds were going to do it themselves, or but that would be a massive shift. So we don't anticipate that change, but there's a lot of changes people haven't anticipated that come about. So, but yeah, I think for now, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, the 6 regional accreditors, again, because the regions of the country are quite different. So in like the middle states and the Higher Learning Commission, which does the central part of the country, they've had a fair number of the big for-profits in those regions. And when those have gone under, you know, there's a lot of concern about how is it that they managed to be accredited for as long as they did. Those are complex stories, but New England, you know, we maybe have 1 or 2 for-profits, and they're small, so it's not such an issue here as it is elsewhere.
You had mentioned earlier, as you were talking about, you know, the commission sort of thinking about, you know, the different ways it might get involved in assuring quality. Certainly, you know, there has been conversation about various sort of changes in terms of how to recognize learning. Obviously, a fair amount of conversation over time over the notion of competency-based learning. And you've sort of talked about, I think, you know, what we would sort of describe as sort of the changing ecosystem of learning these days. The fact that a lot of students come with learning from non-institution, non-accredited, but in many cases, you know, high quality and or industry recognized credentials. And how do you see that ecosystem changing generally, but also maybe say more about how you think that will impact the role and the work of the commission? I mean, we sort of see this notion of sort of expanded necessity of lifelong learning, and in many instances, higher education, you know, may need to be more effective at sort of evaluating and converting, if you will, different currencies of learning in ways that give people pathways and connectivity to additional learning. I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, you know, for a long time, higher education was place-based, credit-based, and the student, you know, whether you student/consumer, but you know, had less a sort of say in where he or she got their education, and it was just sort of considered that you wanted a college degree, you went to an accredited college. And what's shifted, and it's not clear to me that this is necessarily a good shift, but it is a shift, is that it's like sort of almost everything else in the country. There's a consumer-driven movement, and students to some degree now feel less bound to getting their education from a traditional institution, and that's, you know, not the case for, you know, the high flyers that, you know, Harvard and Yale and Williams and Amherst, are, because of their resources and prestige, you know, are never going to suffer for students. But if you look at community colleges, the regional publics, you know, that's where the decrease in enrollment, particularly hit with COVID, has hit the hardest and not yet recovered. So the question for us is sort of understanding that an increasing number of learners are seeking education from outside the traditional market, who's sort of stepping forward to sort of give the stamp of quality assurance to those institutions, to those providers. And you can imagine, I mean, and think about who are they? So we're now, the American Museum of Natural History in New York City is one of the institutions that's coming to us. They have this very high-end, small doctoral program. That's what we're accrediting for them. But museums provide all sorts of educational product. Think about the Smithsonian or museums here in New England. And is there some role for somebody to put their stamp of approval on those? Think about Google or LinkedIn providing education. There's a group of study abroad providers that provide study abroad programs that do it through institutions, but those study abroad providers in some ways look like colleges, and in some cases big colleges, but they're and is there a role for somebody to sort of accredit or recognize them? So I have no idea where this conversation will go, because if you sort of think about our members are the traditional providers. Our commission's made up of 30 members from them. We have a handful of public members, but sort of having that conversation with the leaders of those traditional providers, saying, is there some role for us to recognize your competitors in some way? But we've started that conversation, and these are smart people, and they're aware of what they see around them. And again, they do, we have commissioners from the elite institutions, we have commissioners from community colleges, we have commissioners from small private ones. So they come from different places. So it's hard to sort of say, you go forward 10 years, what's this going to look like? I don't really know, other than I would say, if you look at not comparable businesses and industries, because there's nothing really that's quite comparable, but if you sort of think about the film industry and the music industry and the taxi cab industry, and these are all things that at some point you would have said, yeah, they've been around a long time and they're going to look the same in 10 years, and lo and behold, they don't. So I think it's it's important just to have to begin these conversations. To sort of think higher education is immune from disruption would be a pretty silly thing to think.
Great, thank you.
I think following up on your consumer and industry reference, to say nothing of disruption, is there a role as non-monetary that you can look at besides ROI for the graduates and ROI for the institutions? Are there other ways to judge quality that are non-monetary?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, when we send a team into an institution, we charge that team with looking at student success, retention, grad rates, salaries post-graduation, but we also look hard at the academic program, the quality of the teaching, the depth and quality of services they're providing to students, on mental health being an example. We look at the financial sustainability of an institution. I don't, focusing on a single metric is, I think, never a good idea. We accredit institutions that are, whose students are professionally driven. They go out and they become engineers. That's what they do. So if you want to sort of think, if you're going to, measure salary, and after the first year and 5 years, they're going to look really well. And then we have institutions that are, more with a liberal arts focus, and where those students come out and maybe they go to the Peace Corps, or they, Teach for America, and you look at their salaries, a year or three out, and they don't look so good. And a lot of those graduates become CEOs and leaders of companies later in their career because of their education. So it's, go back to the start when I talking about my tour. I mean, every institution has its own mission, many of them unique. And there's value in that. And, the value, we at Oglethorpe, where I led, we had this sort of make a life, make a living, make a difference. And we had some students that excelled across all three, and we had some students that were making a tremendous living, and then some students that, had built this rich life for themselves, that and their families and their community, where compensation wasn't the big driver. I think one of the, I've got four of my own kids. I sort of think about that generation, and sort of ask each of my kids, and they're, the youngest is 30 now, so they're out in the world, and I got grandkids, and making a good living in terms of compensation is not unimportant to them, but there are other things that are equally important that would, my generation might not have held in such high value. And so, you see students and young people making choices these days that, it's not all driven by what they can make, but it's, built around, can they build a life that works for them, that values, it's a different set of values than my generation had, and certainly a different set of values. I go back to my father, that generation, he got out of work, worked for the same company for 40 years, and retired, never thought about changing. And these days, the students get out of college, and in the first 5 years, they got 6 jobs. I mean, it's crazy. I remember having a conversation with my oldest son, who was deciding to change careers. And I said, well, that's great. The one thing I'd advise you is, don't leave your job till you have another job. And 2 weeks later, my wife says, hey, did you hear he quit? And I was like, what? I just told him to. Does he have a job? No. He just left. He's not worried. He's like, yep. It's a different world.
Different world indeed. Back to sort of the accreditation, craft and process, if you will. There have been sort of pushes and I think suggestions nationally that the accreditation process ought to be more transparent and more open. Tell us sort of how you think about that, your general view, how that impacts how you do work at the commission, and sort of what the future holds relative to sort of the, it's sort of the combination, I guess. It's an expansion of the triad. It's obviously, you've got the state role, you've got the federal role, you've got the accreditor role, but there's sort of a public role here too, right? And sort of a perception.
Yeah, so it's, we are required to be recognized and then re-recognized by the Department of Education every 5 years, and we go through. And so we're up in front of them February 2023, and we've just submitted our petition, and they've made comments back, and then we'll appear in front of NEJHE, which is this sort of odd public body, I guess, if you will, in DC. So that, there's tension there. Generally, I think it's healthy tension that, we have a dual mission, and that's that role of helping our institutions get better. And then also serving the public. And so when we feel like there's an institution that's not meeting our standards, then we have an obligation at a certain level to make sure the public is aware of that. We adopted a new status, goes back a couple of years now. We used to have this thing called notice of concern, which was a private communication to an institution saying, you still meet our standard on this, but we're worried, and this is why we're worried. And so we're gonna stay in touch and to follow up. And then we had And again, that was a private communication. And then the next thing was probation, which is very public. So we adopted this sort of intermediate step called notation, which is public, where we say, you're still meeting our standard, but you're pretty close to the edge of the table. And in a way that we feel like the public ought to know. And that, there was, I think, both sort of internal impetus to make that change, but there was also external pressure from DC. So, I think that tension is healthy, but sort of understanding we do have a dual role. And as we're trying to help institutions improve, sort of airing that laundry out in public doesn't always serve that purpose. But there is a point at which Commission does feel like the public deserves to know. And so we have this status, and we've got a number of institutions on notation, and you can go on notation and get the problem fixed and come off, or you can be on notation and head to probation. And we've seen both. I mean, one of the really interesting things, if you looked at institutions and maybe just on the financial health score, and you'd look at a particular institution, their enrollment and finances, and you'd go, boy, the chances of them being successful look pretty slim. But leadership matters, and that's both administrative leadership and board leadership. And when you've got an alignment between the board and a president with a clear strategy, it often can turn a situation where you think, well, there's no chance, into an institution that thrives. And so, again, if you just sort of looked at a single metric, you might say, yep, let's shut that place down. But I think it takes a more nuanced look, and we've seen fragile institutions get healthy and thrive, and we've seen, and that generally, if you wanted to point to a single thing, it would be leadership. And then we've seen institutions that actually look more healthy than others, and poor leadership can drive that institution right down the tubes. And I think it's probably harder these days than not to get that alignment. We was talking to somebody the other day. I think there are over 200 Catholic colleges in the country, and over 70 of them are looking for new presidents this year. And you've seen, I think it's partly a post-COVID thing, or people felt like they didn't want to leave in the middle of it, but also COVID has exhausted them. That you're just seeing a lot of turnover in presidential leadership, and generally short presidential tenures is not a good thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I really appreciate your point on leadership, and certainly would concur with that. And we sort of talk about it in terms of sort of a strategic governance gap sometimes between board and president, or board and president and the rest of the institution. And it really is a complicated process for making all of those things align and result in effective change. So we appreciate those thoughts.
Yeah.
Going back a little bit back to your earlier point, so you were talking about issues relative to transparency and disclosures and communications. It seems to me in the past there's been a fair amount of variation amongst accreditors in terms of how they do that, in terms of their processes. Have you seen that range narrow at all, or do you still see a fair amount of diversity there in terms of the types of notice used and sort of inclination to sort of share information publicly versus not?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that our terminology is different. So people, you might sort of think we treat institutions differently because we have different terminology. But my sense is just in these 2 years, and I, spent 15 years with Middle States and 15 years with, SACS as an institution, that the 6 regional accreditors have a pretty consistent approach to when they take action. So again, our terminology can be different, and that can be confusing, but I think the regional accreditors do, I think, a really good job, again, differently, and the cultures are different, in both trying to help institutions improve, and then when the picture turns bleak, and whether that's the quality of its academic program or finances or governance, to do the appropriate thing. So and it is interesting, we're now, we up until July 2020, we were 6 presidents of the regionals were colleagues. I could still consider them colleagues, but we're now sort of competing colleagues, which we never used to be. So it's a little, it's a little different. We're not, it's not cutthroat competing for sure. And I don't think there's going to be a lot of movement, but it is, it's changed the dynamics some.
Yeah, understandably. That's interesting.
Do you think that students and parents have a consciousness about accreditation and which accreditors have accredited what?
No. One of the things the commissions we're going to talk about at our retreat, the amount of data on institutions that different regionals provide is quite different. So if you look at the Western Association, they have a very rich data bank public on their site about institutions. It's all from publicly available information. And one of the questions we're asking ourselves is what is the role of an accreditor in helping families make a decision about college? And I'm not quite sure what that answer is. I mean, people go on the college scorecard now, there's all these rankings and guidebooks. People aren't really going on an accreditor site to decide, should I decide to go to Amherst? I mean, or even, a public institution. So we have a lot of data. That data is all publicly available. Most of it is on this college scorecard. If and then I think parents do go to the college scorecard to look at, success rates, grad rates, retention rates, things like that. I think that's a valuable tool. But what our sort of role in that is, I don't know. Every once in a while we'll get a call from somebody to ask if some institution's accredited or were they accredited, but unless an institution's in trouble and shows up in the headlines, I think parents and students aren't just assume things are fine. They don't, and they're not using accreditation as a way to make a decision. Again, unless school's in the headlines.
To say, is the technical step of going to probation, does that make headlines necessarily?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it depends on whether a newspaper picks it up, but yeah, if the school goes on notation or probation, it will generally show up in the newspaper.
Right.
It doesn't happen that often, but and then it's posted on our website, and we require an institution to post it on their website. So to the extent that people click the accreditation button on a school's website and a school was on some kind of notation or probation, it shows right up there.
Right. Another thing, I should probably know more about this, but there was Massachusetts legislation to have institutions follow a process of warning that they were in trouble. Is that something you see regionally potentially?
So so this was a sort of post Mount Ida closure reaction, and the legislature adopted a piece of legislation that required institutions to report annually their financial status. And if they were at the risk of imminent closure, which meant within the next 18 months, that they had to inform the state. And then the Mass Department of Higher Education has basically sort of outsourced that function to us. So we We screen them annually. Every independent institution in Massachusetts. And then we did find that annual screening to be valuable. And so we've now extended, we screen every private institution that we accredit, whether they're in Massachusetts or not. Connecticut, Connecticut legislature is considering adopting language similar to Massachusetts. But, I'd say that generally the depth of a state's higher education staffing, varies a lot. Massachusetts is probably it's got the healthiest in terms of funding and people, but we've got states where, there's not much happening there, and there's not people. So you sort of have to be careful what you wish for, because if you're putting this legislation that requires one of the things Massachusetts, it requires all board members to get a financial training, and that's a big project, and we participate in that.
Any sort of other sort of final thoughts or sort of observations about the future of higher education generally, the region specifically, and sort of accreditation? Are there any other sort of key points to be made at this juncture of time, place, and circumstance?
Yeah, so I think the demographic changes in New England, everybody knows about. They're not changing. They're accelerating. And they're not short term. You look at the birth rates, which have been steadily declining. COVID dropped those rates even more. Interesting. You'd sort of think maybe if people were stuck in their house, they'd go up, but they actually went down. But I think it's concern about financial security and people concerned about having children and being able to support them. So the country as a whole is seeing that flattening, but regionally, it's the Midwest and New England where both the birth rates are lower and the out-migration is higher. And so this is an issue that's with us. And as fewer students graduate from college and graduate from high school and head on to college, it's going to impact institutions, and in particular, it's also who's graduating from high school. So it's a much more diverse group of students graduating from high schools these days than 10, 20 years ago. So it's not just the number of students, but their backgrounds, and in some cases their preparedness for college. So again, I think it's a shrinking population, which will mean in the end that there will be fewer institutions, and there will be winners and some losers, and you'll see some institutions grow and you'll see institutions shrink. And I say we'll continue to see closures, but I think more than that, you're going to see schools with differential assets coming together to try to become stronger. That's what we're seeing, and you'll see that on the public and the private side.
Fantastic.
Thank you for your time. This has been great.
I appreciate it. Good to see you both.
Pleasure's ours. Thanks a lot for your time and thoughts, Larry.
Thanks,
We'll see you soon. Best to you and your team.